are we heading for another French Revolution?
Well, in a certain sense, the peasants have been already at the gates in a lot of countries. But I guess the concern that I have is that a lot of people, a lot of educated people, the people that I deal with in my life, understand intellectually about the 1% and the 99% and growing inequality, and you see the statistics, but they don't really understand the lived reality of this. So, for example, in the United States, you have this old white working class that used to be, the majority of citizens in the United States. This group has really done terribly. You can describe this in economic statistics, but there's some social statistics that are just devastating. So, for example, in the year 2015, 650,000 Americans died of drug overdoses because there's an epidemic of opioid drug addiction, predominantly in rural areas, less educated people. Unlike the 1980s with the crack revolution, this is mostly white working class people that are having this kind of problem. And I think that, the people that live in my city of Palo Alto live in this nice bubble where, they can see all the upward trends, and they don't understand that there's been this big social cost that is being paid by people that don't have the education, that don't have the job skills, and also don't have the flexibility, to adapt to the kinds of new requirements that this economy is generating.
Yeah. In South Africa, we've probably got one of the worst Gini coefficients in the world.
That's right.
And we live this very painful reality of growing inequality and almost a powerlessness to try and address it. So I'm going to circle back to the French Revolution question. How do we avoid, because it almost seems like that's an eventuality unless something changes. Mm-hmm. So what are some of the things which the world, and particularly us in this room, can do to kind of shift the course of history towards that outcome, or away from that outcome at least?
Right. So the people in this room, I'm not sure, are going to be the primary agents that will be dealing with this problem. Now, every company has got, a human resources issue, and you can make decisions about, being kinder and gentler in the ways that you deal with employees and the like. But ultimately, the pressures of a competitive marketplace mean that people are going to have to take decisions that will not be good for a number of employees. Otherwise, your company is going to go out of business. And so I don't have a lot of illusions. Everybody would like to be a socially responsible, business, take account of stakeholders and, the larger community. And I think that's a really important dimension to it. But ultimately, I think a lot of the real solutions are going to, unfortunately, devolve on governments. I say that I'm a political scientist, and that's what I study. So maybe I tend to think, in those terms. But in fact, I think a lot of the, efforts are going to come in areas like education, because this is this relentless replacement of human occupations with machines. This has been going on since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, but it's a process that has greatly accelerated. And now with the advent of AI and extremely intelligent machines, this is something that's going to be quite relentless, and that means that there's an obligation on the part of the rest of society to constantly make sufficient investments so that people develop skills that are appropriate to this in this new world.
So anyone in education, certainly opportunity there. But maybe talk a little bit about the big problems that you see, because we all live in our Silicon Valley bubbles of various sorts in the parts of the world that we come from. You look more broadly beyond that at the kind of systemic problems facing society, because I think in those problems are the opportunities for us to try and tackle those things. So maybe let's spend a few minutes talking about that.
Yeah, so I think that whereas the previous 30 years was really an age of cosmopolitan, globalism, we are really heading into a nationalistic period right now, and this is true in virtually every part of the world. In some places like Europe, you're seeing these grassroots right-wing anti-immigrant movements springing up. National identity is all of a sudden a really big issue. What is our religion? What do we look like, ethnically as peoples, and what are the common values that we share? And unfortunately, one nationalism kind of breeds opposing nationalisms because people develop this kind of social solidarity in opposition to another who, is an enemy. And you can see this. I mean, it's going on big time in Asia. China, Japan, Korea have been at each other's throats, for some time, and it hasn't gotten better as time has gone on. This generation is much more nationalistic than the previous one. In Europe and in the United States, immigration is, a central issue. I talked about the economic disruption, but it overlaps with the identity issue in ways that are very hard to disentangle. And so, so this is why I was saying disruption is something that is not valued by the vast majority of people in the world. One of the big disruptions that's been happening is cultural disruption. People can get used to living in very multicultural, diverse communities, but it takes time, and the rate of change, I think, has been faster than that process of adjustment. And the policies that governments have pursued to try to mitigate this really haven't been keeping up with that pace of change.
And is there something we should be kind of demanding of government in the countries that we live to try and help this?
Well, this gets into a real basic political issue. I think that any businessman in any time and any country does not like regulation, basically feels in a kind of adversarial relationship with the state. Because, regulation, the more you regulate, the less activity you get, and that's just inevitable. But I do think that you need a kind of longer-term attitude towards the social good that is possible to be pursued if there's a more cooperative relationship, not an adversarial one, but a more cooperative relationship between governments and the private sector. You don't get wealth without the private sector, but you don't have a private sector without, a government that can actually create stability, property rights, rule of law, all of the things that are needed for economic transactions to happen. And there are certainly business communities that are much more socially minded. I'll just give you one example of this from my own experience in Colombia. You had this horrible period in the 1990s where Colombia had the highest murder rate in the world because of Pablo Escobar and this accelerating narco war. Two Colombian cities had very different reactions. So Medellin, where Escobar operated, you had a very cohesive and very responsible business community. In Cali, you didn't. You had a Cali cartel there that was just as vicious and violent. A lot of the elite, the business elite in Cali, left for Miami. They said, okay, we can protect ourselves and our families. We're not going to do that. The ones in Medellin stuck it out. They actually agreed to pay higher taxes, which is quite amazing for a business community, because they said without the right social services, without security, without a government that can actually function, we're not going to survive as businesses. And they stuck it out and engaged in a series of really kind of amazing social programs that eventually had the effect of bringing the murder rate down by a factor of 10. It didn't solve the drug war or anything else, but it made life much more livable. And so this is what some people have called social capital. It's this ability to realize that you're part of a larger society, not simply a profit-maximizing, individual that's only worried about this very short-term, very measurable kind of outcome, but you're also worried about, the longer-term environment in which you're operating.
I'm sure many entrepreneurs in the room who come from developing countries like ours feel this pressure, but we've got a company that's growing like a weed and a country that feels like it could be kind of going towards a banana republic. Very corrupt president. Yeah. We've got growing kind of inequality, growing unemployment. And there's a pressure on me as a business owner to think, well, should I just leave?
Yeah. Well, actually, there's three alternatives in that kind of a situation. You can leave, you can try to play by the rules and get hammered, or you can try to join the corrupt politicians and cut your own private deal. And I'm afraid that, that's a decision that a lot of people, just to protect themselves end up, end up making. And that, leads you in a situation of crony capitalism. It's not real market capitalism. I mean, there, you're not going to have the level playing field. You're not going to have real innovation because basically it's the political insider. And by the way, I don't mean to pick on developing countries, in this. I mean, I think that unfortunately in the United States, we're seeing the beginnings of this kind of capture of the government. And I think this is a lesson that all of us need to recognize, that it's not as if you graduate to a certain level of liberal democracy and a market economy and then you just stay on top forever. Everybody is capable of decaying and falling back. And I think that, I've been arguing that we've been seeing this in the United States going on for the past generation in terms of American institutions. And that's something that, as an American, I find, very, very troubling.
I've spoke with somebody who's the son of a senator who worked with Richard Nixon. So he's now been through Vietnam, and he says he's never seen America as charged as it is right now, but at a grassroots level. It feels like, and we spoke about this in the session before, that there needs to be a catalyst event that happens to get people to change, to prevent the decay. And are you seeing that as well across the States, or is that just a West Coast?
Yeah, I think that, unfortunately, human societies are really conservative. They develop ways of doing things. They get very, very settled and comfortable. And sometimes it gets worse the better it gets. If you have a long period of growth and prosperity and relative stability, you get powerful interest groups and elites capturing, the state mechanism. And sometimes it takes a huge external event like a war, revolution, a big, big financial crisis. And by the way, the one that we experienced in 2008 was not big enough to really shake things loose in the United States and in Europe. So unfortunately, that's the way human beings are. They're stubborn mules, and you have to hit them on the head with a 2x4, before they actually begin to change.
Yeah. No, let's not take that literally. No hitting people with 2x4s. Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about the role of social media. I think we've seen the pros and the cons. It's been a massive rise, which has done a lot of good in the world, but it has a dark underbelly. Maybe how do you see that, the role of social media in the future in helping us kind of move forwards, not backwards?
Well, that's another area where things have turned darker just in the last few years. In the 1990s, with the growth of the World Wide Web, I think I and most other observers thought that this would be great for democracy. Democracy is based on ordinary people having power. Information is power. The more information they have, the more power they're going to have. And in fact, you saw that working out in a whole variety of authoritarian countries, in Russia, in Ukraine, in the Arab Spring. It's a great mobilizational tool. If you want to protest a dictatorship, it's a great way of getting people out into Tahrir Square or Maidan, to organize. I think what you've seen, however, is that there's adjustment by authoritarian forces, and particularly the Russians realized several years ago that this was something that was being used against them, but they could turn it around and use it against democracies, and democracies are vulnerable to this in a way that an authoritarian country isn't, because they hold elections. And so they began to realize that what the internet has done is to blow away all the gatekeepers. People celebrated this once, but these are editors, these are fact checkers, these are people that vouch for the reliability just of factual data. And what we're seeing now is a completely flat world in which every information source is basically as valid as every other information source. And as a result, fake news and low-quality information deliberately manufactured by armies of trolls and bots, sometimes by foreign powers, but sometimes by political actors within a democracy, have been, I think, distorting the democratic practice. I don't think that this is the end of democracy, because I think there have been many technological innovations in the past that have been similarly posed threats to political order, and I think we're going to figure this one out. But we're right in the middle of, I think, an attack, a kind of broad attack using the new technologies to undermine people's trust and confidence in all established institutions. And democracy is not going to survive, for very long if people don't, believe in at least some institutions being trustworthy.
Social media has, in essence, become the voice of the people. And while some are using it to manipulate, it still remains a source of people kind of just sharing their opinions and their frustrations. And that underlying, if we go back to the French Revolution question, people aren't standing at the gates anymore. They're going online.
No, that's right. And that's not entirely a bad thing. I mean, since I'm an elite and I live in an elite part of the United States, it's very easy to lose touch with what's going on in other parts of the world. But you're right that social media has been, actually legitimately democratizing, because a lot of people that were being screwed by a lot of the economic policies, pursued by elites, finally found a way to make their anger and unhappiness known to others. And so I don't think that we should just sit back and say, well, they're just, they just don't understand, how modern economies work, and it's their ignorance that's driving this. I think it's a genuine cry of pain in many cases that ought to be part of a democratic discussion.
I agree. I think the history of South Africa coming out of apartheid, many white South Africans have wrestled with what is our role in the country in the future. And that's been a very difficult thing to discover. And one of the keys, certainly for me, has been learning the art of listening, to sit with people of different backgrounds who have been hurt by the systemic injustice. And that's helped heal wounds and take us forward as a country in many respects. And it feels like social media gives us that ability to listen better. So what are some of the ways where we can maybe see beyond our echo chambers, just to hear the pain of others?
Well, we were discussing this in our prior to coming into this room. I mean, what I've tried to do is deliberately on my Twitter feed, put some, big Trump supporters and really Tea Party and all these right-wing characters that I disagree with. So I actually have to follow what they say. It's very painful. This is really painful. And every day I say, I'm going to kick half of these people off of my Twitter feed because I just can't stand, But, I do think that it is so easy. It is so easy to protect yourself, to live in a comfortable place where everybody basically has your political and social opinions, and anytime you express an opinion, you get lots of validation because, everyone's retweeting the same, sentiments, and it makes you feel good. But I think it's seriously misleading. And, I guess, so I've been thinking in a room of entrepreneurs, exactly what since I think a lot of these issues are political ones that you and your companies cannot address directly, what is it, that you really need to do? And I just think the first thing begins with awareness, that you're living in this world that does not like disruption, that is reacting against disruption, and that will take to the streets, or it'll take to social media, in defense of what they regard as, their settled way of life.
I feel like I can keep asking questions forever, but we do have to keep to a schedule. And I know there are probably hundreds of people in the audience who are wishing they could be in my place right now asking the questions. So let's open the floor to some of those. You can just raise the light so we can see the hands. While the mic goes there, I just want to say thank you for giving up the time to come and speak to us. I think these are important issues which we need to...
A friend of mine owns a brewery here in Half Moon Bay, and I intend to go visit that after I'm done here. So I had other motives.
You might find some people going with you.
Hi, Andres Posada from Colombia. So I have a quick question. I feel like we're in a catch-22 because we have to wait for a terrible event to happen, but we want to also help and try to solve issues before they happen. So what do you recommend for young entrepreneurs that are trying to, have a positive impact right now? Is there a way, I don't know, to get involved in politics, or do we what do you recommend for us, basically?
So I think that the involvement in politics is kind of inevitable. I think a lot of American technology companies in Silicon Valley didn't have lobbying offices in Washington because they just saw that as a negative thing that would only get in their way, and as long as they could ignore it, they would try to do so. And I think that they have increasingly realized that they simply can't, that politics, if they stay away from politics, politics is going to come visit them. And I think what then is needed is, to think about, to the extent that you want to shape policies that will affect you, how do you do it, but how do you do it in a way that suits the long-term interest, not just of your company, not just your sector, but the broader society in which you live? And I think when you talk about self-interest, you can think about self-interest in a lot of different ways. It's really not fixed. It can be just the short, next quarter's revenues, or it can be in terms of the longer-term environment that you are going to face, down the road in 5 years or 10 years and so forth. And you need collective action. No individual company by itself is ever going to address any of these issues. It's not possible. So you need collective action, which means you need to get together with like-minded people. You've got to mobilize. You've got to figure out an agenda and, and act on that.
Hello, my name is Rabia Nassar from Lebanon. You've mentioned, earlier in the discussion, the difference between democratic and non-democratic countries. But now that the system of checks and balances have been largely hacked in democratic countries, how do you make the difference between is there still a democratic country with this, when it costs $300 million to elect a senator, for example? Are we sliding into an age of no democracy, dark age of no democracy, globally?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think that things are that dire yet, because, so it's true that many democracies, beginning with American democracy, are quite imperfect, the role of money in politics, as you mentioned. But, when you go over to other places where it's simply impossible to elect an alternative to the current ruling party or the current president, and there are quite a number of countries that are like that now, you see that, there's still a degree of freedom and a degree of accountability in most developed democracies that still means something, and it's something that's very important to hold on to, that there still are important checks. This is a debate we're having in the United States about Donald Trump, because many people, progressive people in the US, feared that he was going to be an American tyrant. And I would say, we just hit the 100-day mark on Saturday. I was asked to do an assessment of this, as were a lot of other people, and my conclusion is American institutions are actually working. I mean, he's doing a lot of damage, in my view, in terms of corruption, in terms of, no support for global democracy, human rights, but in terms of his being an American tyrant, I think our institutions are actually containing him, quite successfully. So I do think that it's important not to get overly pessimistic, and realize that it's important to hold on to the democratic practices and the checks and balances that we have.
I'm John from Turkey. In addition to democracy, do you think nation states are threatened by technology, disruptive technologies in terms of cryptocurrencies, in terms of their ability to tax? Do you see a similar threat to them, like the empires before the First World War?
No, I think that it's a dialectical process. So it's clearly the case that globalization and technology have made it much harder to enforce rules over a particular territory. Capital, in particular, is really mobile, and you would have to have a degree of cooperation in the international system that just hasn't been forthcoming if you were really going to control that. But I think that in the end, all companies need territory. You know, they have operating bases where they have to interact with governments. And so I think that this idea that there's some kind of twilight of sovereignty is a little bit premature. This was a book by Walter Wriston written back in the 1990s, where in the first phase of globalization, people thought that, businesses were, and criminal gangs and a lot of other things were escaping the control of nation states. I don't think we're at that point. The thing is, though, every decade brings a different kind of challenge. So cryptocurrencies did not exist 10 years ago, and in another 10 years, we'll have another technology that will be, similarly challenging. And the problem is really, for the politics to keep up.
Time for one more question. There we go.
Yes. One of the books that has impacted me the most is Trust. Do you think we are seeing a breakdown of trust in many countries today? Has it got to do with corruption?
Yeah, that's an easy one to answer. The answer is yes. And that's something that actually I think you can measure fairly empirically, because there are a lot of surveys. Do you trust the government? Do you trust these different institutions? Do you trust your fellow citizens? There's been a broad decline of trust across the world, and particularly in developed countries and it's not recent. It's been going on for the last 50 years. In many countries, you have sharp polarization within the political system, so a lot of outright hatred between different political parties and different political orientations and the like. And trust is one of those informal qualities that countries really depend on. If everything has to be regulated through litigation and formal institutions, it's like a machine that loses all of its lubricant. Things will seize up. And so I think the generation of trust is really important. Where does it come from? That's a pretty complicated issue, but a lot of it comes through performance. And so people trust companies that actually deliver things that they're going to deliver. They trust governments that actually provide services and enforce laws and this sort of thing. But I think it's something we need to worry about. And I think that in terms of your own organization, I have no idea how to increase the level of trust in a big society as a whole. You can do it in an organization, right? It begins really at the top. It begins with the CEO. It begins with the way you treat employees. It begins with the way you communicate. It begins with the way that people in the company, learn to communicate with one another. And that's something that I think probably everybody in this room has a great deal of control over.
Our time is up. I think I want to say two thank yous. One, thank you for being here with us today and just sharing some thoughts. And I think beyond that, thank you for giving your life to studying this very important area to help us move society forward. So a round of applause.
Thank you.
Francis, thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.